The great hall of the Galactic Council stretched before Princess Valara Kefsolan like an endless ocean of stars and marble. And she stood at its center with her spine straight, and her golden eyes betraying nothing of the storm inside her heart. She was Solari, one of the elegant and long-lived people who had ruled the Ascendancy for 10,000 years. And her silver skin caught the light of 100 floating crystals as she waited for the verdict that would change her life forever. The war against the Varkith Dominion had been raging for 15 years now, and her people were losing badly despite all their advanced technology and ancient wisdom. The Varkith were monsters in every sense of the word, standing 8 feet tall with armored bodies and claws that could tear through metal like paper. And they had already consumed 12 star systems that once belonged to the Ascendancy. Every month brought news of another fallen colony, another million Solari dead or enslaved, and the great empire that had stood for millennia was crumbling like sand before a hurricane. That was why Valara stood here today, why her father the Emperor had sent her to beg for help from the most unlikely allies in the galaxy. The humans of Earth had only discovered faster than light travel 200 years ago, and they were considered primitives by most of the galactic community. They lived on a world so hostile that the Galactic Survey had classified it as a Class 7 death world, a place where everything from the weather to the wildlife seemed designed to kill. Their lifespans were laughably short compared to the Solari, barely a century if they were lucky, and their technology was generations behind the great powers of the galaxy. And yet they had something that no other species possessed, something that made the Varkith hesitate whenever human ships appeared on the battlefield. Nobody could quite explain what it was, but the humans had never lost a war since joining the galactic community, and even the mighty Varkith had avoided direct conflict with them. So the Ascendancy had come to Earth with offers of alliance, bringing gold and technology and territory as gifts. The humans had refused everything. They did not want riches or knowledge or land, and their ambassador had sat across from the Emperor with a strange smile on his face as he made his counter-demand. They wanted a marriage, a union between their species and the Solari royal family to seal the pact in blood and honor. Valara had heard the gasps of outrage from her father's advisors, had seen the fury in her brother's eyes at such an insulting demand. But she had also seen the desperation in her father's face, the weight of millions of deaths pressing down on his ancient shoulders. So she had stepped forward and volunteered herself as the bride. Now she waited in the council hall for her future husband to arrive, and every second felt like an eternity of dread and anger and wounded pride. The great doors opened with a sound like thunder, and Valara forced herself not to flinch as the human delegation entered. She had expected warriors in gleaming armor, giants who would match the Varkith in size and brutality. Instead, she saw a small group of men and women in simple gray uniforms, walking with a quiet confidence that seemed almost casual. And at their head was the man who would be her husband. Commander Marcus Cole was not what she had imagined at all. Standing only slightly taller than her with brown hair touched by gray at the temples and eyes the color of Earth's oceans. He was not handsome by Solari standards, his features too rough and his skin too weathered by sun and wind and time. But there was something in the way he moved that made Valara's instincts scream warnings, something in his scarred hands and calm gaze that spoke of danger barely contained. He stopped before her and offered a bow that was respectful but not subservient, and when he spoke his voice was soft and steady. "Princess Valara, I am honored to meet you at last, and I hope we can build something meaningful from this arrangement." She returned his bow with the precise elegance of Solari nobility, keeping her face as cold as the void between stars. "Commander Cole, I welcome you to the council hall and accept this union for the sake of my people." The ceremony itself was a grand affair that lasted for hours, with priests from both species performing rituals that meant nothing to either of them. Valara spoke her vows in a clear voice that echoed through the hall, promising to honor and support this stranger who had been thrust upon her by the cruelty of war. Marcus spoke his own vows with a sincerity that confused her, his words carrying weight and meaning that seemed genuine rather than political. When the final blessing was pronounced and they were declared bound in the eyes of the galaxy, Valara felt something cold settle in her chest. She was married now to an alien, a primitive creature from a death world, all because the Varkith had brought her great civilization to its knees. The celebration that followed was a blur of faces and congratulations and thinly veiled contempt from the Solari nobility. She heard them whispering behind their hands about the shame of it all, about how far the royal family had fallen to accept such a match. Marcus seemed not to notice or not to care, accepting each insult disguised as compliment with that same quiet smile. When the festivities finally ended, and they were escorted to the chambers that would be their shared home, Valara braced herself for whatever would come next. She had heard stories about human mating customs, brutal and animalistic things that made her skin crawl with disgust. But Marcus did not approach her bed at all. Instead, he walked to the great window that looked out over the capital city and stood there in silence, watching the stars with an expression she could not read. Minutes passed, then an hour, and still he did not move or speak. Finally, Valara could bear the tension no longer. "Are you not going to claim your rights as my husband?" she demanded, her voice sharp with confusion and lingering fear. Marcus turned to look at her, and for a moment she saw something ancient and tired in his eyes. "I did not come here for you, princess, and I have no intention of forcing myself upon someone who does not want me." His words struck her like a physical blow, so unexpected that she could not form a response. "I came here to end a war," he continued, turning back to the stars, "and that is what I intend to do. So you may rest easy tonight, and every night until you decide otherwise." Valara lay awake long after Marcus had settled into a chair by the window, her mind churning with questions that had no answers. Who was this strange human who refused to take what was offered, who spoke of ending wars with the same casual tone others used to discuss the weather? She did not know it yet, but she had just married the most dangerous man in the galaxy, and nothing in her long and privileged life had prepared her for what was to come. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding, and Valara found herself watching her human husband with the same fascination one might give to a dangerous animal. Marcus Cole was a puzzle, wrapped in mystery, wrapped in silence, and everything he did seemed designed to confuse and unsettle the Solari court. He woke before dawn every morning without fail, slipping out of their chambers while the stars still burned bright in the sky. Valara had followed him once, curious about where he went during those dark hours, and what she found had shaken her to her core. The palace gardens were famous throughout the Ascendancy for their beauty and tranquility, filled with flowers from 1,000 worlds and fountains that sang with crystal voices. But Marcus did not come to admire the flowers. He came to train, moving through forms and exercises that looked almost like a dance but carried the unmistakable rhythm of violence. His body twisted and struck at invisible enemies, his scarred hands cutting through the air with precision that made Valara's military training seem clumsy by comparison. She watched him for an hour that first morning, hidden behind a pillar of white stone, and by the end she was trembling with something that might have been fear or might have been awe. This was not the training of a soldier or even a warrior. This was the training of a predator, honed over years or perhaps decades of constant practice. The Solari generals did not see what she saw, dismissing Marcus as a curiosity at best and a joke at worst. General Taurus was the loudest voice of contempt, a decorated hero who had fought the Varkith for 40 years and lost 3 sons to their claws. "The humans are soft," he declared at every war council, his purple eyes burning with disdain. "They live on their death world because they are too stupid to leave. and their short lives prove that nature itself rejects them. Marcus attended every council meeting but rarely spoke, sitting in his chair with that quiet smile while the generals argued and postured and ignored him completely. He asked questions sometimes, simple things about supply lines and troop movements and enemy tactics that the Solari answered with barely concealed impatience. But Valara noticed that he remembered every answer, filing the information away behind those ocean-colored eyes. She also noticed that he was learning their language at an impossible rate, picking up words and phrases and grammar that took most species years to master. Within 2 weeks, he was speaking fluent Solari with only a trace of accent, and within 3, he was reading their ancient texts and military histories. "Your husband is strange," her handmaiden Lyria whispered one evening as they prepared for another endless court function. "He does not act like any human I have read about." Valara had no answer to give, because she had been thinking the same thing every day since the wedding. The breaking point came during a sparring demonstration in the palace training grounds. General Torath had arranged it as entertainment for visiting dignitaries, a chance to show off the might of the Solari military. A dozen of the finest warriors in the Ascendancy took turns fighting each other, their movements graceful and deadly as they danced with practiced blades. When the demonstrations ended, Torath turned to Marcus with a smile that held no warmth. "Perhaps our human guest would like to show us how his people fight. Or is that too much to ask of a species that still counted years on their fingers when we were building starships?" The insult hung in the air like poison, and Valara felt her cheeks burn with anger on her husband's behalf, despite herself. Marcus simply smiled and rose from his seat, removing his jacket as he walked toward the training circle. "I would be honored to demonstrate, General. Though I fear my skills are quite primitive compared to your warriors." A Solari champion was chosen to face him. A young man named Kiris, who had won every tournament for the past 5 years. They squared off in the circle, Karis holding his practice blade with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. The signal was given, and Karis lunged forward with blinding speed, his blade arcing toward Marcus in a strike that would have taken the head off any normal opponent. Marcus was not there. He had moved before the strike even began, sliding around Karis like water flowing past a stone. His hand shot out and caught the warrior's wrist, twisting in a way that made Karis cry out in shock and pain. The practice blade clattered to the ground, and Marcus released his grip, stepping back with that same quiet smile. "Again," Karis snarled, his pride burning hotter than his throbbing wrist. They fought 3 more times, and each exchange ended the same way, with Karis disarmed and humiliated while Marcus stood untouched. The watching dignitaries had gone very quiet, their earlier amusement replaced by something closer to unease. General Tarath's face had turned the color of old wine, his hands clenched at his sides. "A trick," he spat. "Nothing more than alien trickery. Let us see how the human handles something more substantial." He gestured toward a stone pillar at the edge of the training ground, a decorative column as thick as a man's torso. "In the Solari military, we test our strength against the unyielding stone. Perhaps the human would like to try, unless his fragile bones cannot handle such a challenge." The crowd murmured with anticipation, expecting Marcus to refuse or to hurt himself in the attempt. Valara wanted to call out, to spare her husband the embarrassment that surely awaited him. But Marcus was already walking toward the pillar, rolling his shoulders as if preparing for a casual stretch. He stood before the stone for a long moment, his breathing slow and steady. Then he moved. His fist struck the pillar with a sound like thunder, and cracks spiderwebbed across the surface from the point of impact. A second strike followed, then a third, each blow landing with devastating precision. The pillar shattered, great chunks of stone tumbling to the ground in a cloud of dust and debris. Absolute silence fell over the training ground. Marcus turned to face the crowd, his knuckles bloody, but his expression unchanged. On Earth, we have a saying, General, never mistake patience for weakness. That night, Lord Historian Sivan, the oldest and wisest of the Emperor's advisors, came to Valara's chambers with fear in his ancient eyes. Your Highness, I must speak with you about your husband. I have been researching his species since the wedding, and what I have found terrifies me. He spread holographic images across the table. Pictures of Earth and its history that made Valara's stomach turn. This is their homeworld, a planet where the very air tries to poison them, where the ground shakes and splits without warning, where fire falls from the sky and water rises to swallow cities whole. The images showed humans fighting against beasts that made the Varkith look gentle, surviving floods and famines and wars that would have destroyed any other species. They did not evolve in paradise like us, Your Highness, and they did not evolve as apex predators like the Varkith. Savan's voice dropped to a whisper. They evolved as prey that refused to die, and over millions of years, they became something far more dangerous than any predator. They became survivors who could kill anything that threatened them. Valara looked at the images of war and destruction, at the endless history of a species that had spent its entire existence fighting for survival. What are you saying, Lord Sivan? The old historian met her eyes with something like desperation. I am saying that we have invited a monster into our palace, Your Highness, a monster that chose to wear the face of mercy, and I do not know if that should comfort us or terrify us more than anything else. The news of Sarath Prime reached the palace at midnight, carried by a messenger whose face was gray with horror and despair. The Varkith had struck without warning, dropping 15,000 warriors onto a colony world that held 300,000 Solari civilians. The defense force stationed there was barely 200 strong, equipped for policing rather than war, and they had been overrun in the first hour. Now the Varkith were spreading across the planet like a plague, burning cities and slaughtering everyone they found. Emperor Kethsolan called an emergency war council, his ancient face carved with grief as reports of atrocities poured in from the dying world. We cannot reach them in time, General Torath admitted, his voice hollow with defeat. Our nearest fleet is 4 days away, and by then there will be nothing left to save. The council chamber fell into despair, ministers and generals bowing their heads as they accepted another tragedy in a war full of tragedies. Then Marcus Cole stood up from his chair in the corner, and every eye turned to him. I will go, he said simply, his voice carrying through the silence like a blade. General Torath let out a harsh laugh that held no humor. You human, and what army do you propose to bring against 15,000 Varkith warriors? 12 soldiers. And 1 gunship? The council erupted into chaos, voices shouting over each other in disbelief and outrage. Valara stared at her husband, searching his face for any sign that he was joking or mad or simply did not understand what he was proposing. She found neither. His expression was calm and certain, like a man discussing a walk in the garden rather than a suicide mission against impossible odds. You are insane, Torath snarled. 13 against 15,000. The Varkith will crush you like insects, Marcus smiled. And for the first time, Valara saw something cold and terrible behind his eyes. The Varkith have never fought humans before, General. I think it is time we introduced ourselves. The Emperor raised his hand for silence, studying the human with an expression that mixed curiosity and desperation. Commander Cole, I cannot in good conscience send you to your death, even if you are willing to go. With respect, Your Majesty, you are not sending me anywhere. I am telling you what I intend to do, and I'm asking only for a ship and your permission to try. Something passed between the two leaders. A moment of understanding that excluded everyone else in the room. Very well, the Emperor said at last. You have my permission and my prayers. May you prove me wrong about what is possible. Marcus bowed once and walked out of the council chamber without looking back. Valara caught up with him in the corridor, grabbing his arm with a strength that surprised them both. "You cannot do this, Marcus. It is suicide. And for what? For people you have never met. For an empire that has treated you like dirt since you arrived." He stopped and turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. It was not anger or fear or even determination. It was sorrow, ancient and deep, like the grief of someone who had watched too many people die. "I was a soldier before I was your husband, Valara, and I have spent my whole life protecting people who could not protect themselves." He reached up and touched her face, the first intimate gesture he had ever made toward her. "This is what I am. This is what all of us are. The ones who stand between the innocent and the darkness." Then he was gone, striding down the corridor toward the landing pad where his soldiers waited. The gunship lifted off an hour later, carrying 13 humans into the void against an army. Valara watched it disappear into the stars and felt something twist in her chest that she could not name. The next 46 hours were the longest of her life. No communications came from Sarath Prime, no updates or reports or calls for help. The Solari fleet raced toward the colony at maximum speed, their commanders preparing for the grim task of burying the dead. Valara did not sleep, did not eat, did not leave the communication center, even when her father ordered her to rest. She told herself it was concern for the civilians, for her people suffering under Varkith claws. She knew it was something else. Then the signal came. A single transmission from Sarath Prime, carrying the identification codes of the human gunship. Valara's heart stopped as the communication officer opened the channel. "This is Commander Marcus Cole to Solari High Command. The situation on Sarath Prime has been resolved. Repeat. The situation has been resolved." The voice was calm, almost bored, as if he were reporting on a training exercise rather than a battle. "What do you mean, resolved?" the communication officer demanded, his voice cracking with disbelief. "The Varkith invasion force has been eliminated. We are securing the remaining civilian population and awaiting the arrival of your fleet for evacuation support." Eliminated. "Commander Cole, there were 15,000 Varkith warriors on that planet." A pause. Then Marcus spoke again, and this time there was something like dark amusement in his tone. "There were. Now there are not. Cole out." The fleet arrived 2 days later to find a scene that would haunt their dreams for years to come. The Varkith were dead, all 15,000 of them, scattered across the colony in pieces. They had not died cleanly or quickly, their massive bodies torn apart by weapons and traps and tactics that the Solari had never imagined. Some had been killed by explosives planted in their path. Others had been picked off one by snipers who struck from impossible distances. Hundreds had fallen into pits filled with sharpened stakes, or been crushed by collapsing buildings that had been rigged to fall. And in the center of the carnage, in the Varkith command post, they found the bodies of 47 elite warriors who had been killed in hand-to-hand combat. The forensic teams counted the wounds and reconstructed the battle, their conclusions delivered in voices that trembled with disbelief. One human had done this. One human had walked into a fortress filled with monsters and killed every single one of them, with nothing but a blade and his bare hands. Marcus and his 12 soldiers were waiting at the landing pad when the fleet touched down, covered in black Varkith blood that steamed in the cold air. Several of them were wounded, carrying injuries that would have killed any Solari twice over, but they stood straight and proud. Marcus himself had a gash across his chest that exposed muscle and bone, but he smiled when he saw the Solari soldiers staring at him. "Apologies for the mess. We got a little enthusiastic." General Torath pushed through the crowd, his face a mask of emotions that warred between fury and fear. "What happened here, human? How did you do this? We demand a full report." Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small data chip. tossing it to the general with casual ease. "My after-action report, General. It should answer all your questions." Torath plugged the chip into his personal display, his eyes scanning the contents with increasing disbelief. The report contained 3 words. "We introduced ourselves." Valara watched her husband walk toward the medical shuttle, his blood dripping onto the ground with every step. She had married a stranger, a quiet man who smiled at insults and spoke of peace. Now, she understood what Lord Sivan had tried to tell her, what the Varkith had learned too late. Humans were not the fragile primitives everyone believed them to be. They were something far worse, something that the galaxy had never seen before. They were survivors who had learned to become monsters, and they had chosen to point that monstrous power at the enemies of those they called friends. As the medical shuttle lifted off with Marcus inside, Valara whispered a question that no one could answer. What have we married into our family, and what will it mean for all of us? The footage spread across the galaxy like wildfire, copied and shared and watched by billions of eyes on thousands of worlds. Helmet recordings from the Battle of Sarath Prime, captured by the human soldiers during their impossible assault. Every species with access to the galactic network gathered to watch, their reactions ranging from disbelief to terror to something approaching worship. The recording showed everything. They showed 13 humans dropping from their gunship in the dead of night, their faces painted with dark patterns that made them look like demons from ancient legends. They showed those same humans moving through the colony with silent precision, setting traps and explosives and ambush points with the casual efficiency of farmers planting crops. They showed the first Varkith patrol walking into a killing zone, 8-foot monsters reduced to screaming meat in seconds by weapons and tactics they could not comprehend. And they showed Marcus Cole. The camera in his helmet captured every moment of his personal war, every enemy he killed with blade and fist and fury. He moved through the Varkith like a storm through wheat, untouchable and unstoppable, his body twisting around strikes that should have torn him apart. When he walked into the command post alone, the recording became something that would be studied in military academies for 10,000 years. 47 Varkith elite guards, each one a veteran of hundreds of battles, each one larger and stronger and more heavily armored than anything a human should be able to fight. Marcus killed them all in 11 minutes. He used their own strength against them, redirecting their massive claws into their allies, slipping beneath their guard to strike at joints and throats and eyes. When his blade broke halfway through the slaughter, he continued with his bare hands, tearing through armor that should have been impervious with fingers that found every weakness. The final Varkith commander, a creature called Vorn the Crusher, who had earned his name by killing 100 Solari with his fists, died with a human's hand wrapped around his throat. Marcus held him there for a long moment, letting the dying monster see the face of the thing that had killed him. Then he dropped the body and turned to the camera, his eyes cold and empty. Objective complete, moving to civilian extraction. The galaxy watched and the galaxy trembled. On Solari Prime, the mood in the palace shifted like wind before a storm. The nobles who had mocked Marcus now avoided him in the corridors, pressing themselves against walls as he passed. The servants whispered prayers to ancient gods whenever he entered a room. Even the guards, proud warriors who had sworn to give their lives for the royal family, flinched when his shadow fell across them. General Torath had stopped speaking at war councils, his earlier contempt replaced by a silence that screamed louder than words. The other species of the Ascendancy sent messages of congratulation that barely concealed their new fear. If the humans could do this to the Varkith, what might they do to anyone who displeased them? But the most dramatic change came from outside the Ascendancy. The Varkith Dominion, the empire that had never retreated in 3 centuries of conquest, sent a formal request for ceasefire negotiations. Their ambassador arrived at the palace, looking like he had aged 100 years, his massive form hunched with something that took Valara a moment to recognize. It was fear, pure and absolute, radiating from every scale and claw. "The Dominion wishes to discuss terms," the ambassador announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "We believe a peaceful resolution can be found." The Solari Council erupted into celebration, ministers embracing each other and weeping with relief. 15 years of war ended by one battle, one massacre, one demonstration of what humans could do when they stopped being polite. But Marcus did not celebrate. He stood at the window of the council chamber, watching the ambassador leave, and his expression held no triumph or satisfaction. Valara found him there an hour later, after the celebrations had moved to the grand ballroom. "You should be with the others," she said, moving to stand beside him. "This is your victory." "This is not victory," he replied, his voice flat and tired. "This is a pause. The Varkith will recover from their fear eventually. And when they do, they will come back angrier than before." "Then what would you call it?" He turned to look at her, and she saw the same sorrow she had glimpsed before he left for Sareth Prime. A beginning, the first move in a game that will only end when one side is completely destroyed. He walked away from the window and sat in a chair by the fireplace, pulling out a blade that Valara recognized. It was old, made of actual metal rather than energy or light, worn smooth by years of handling. "What is that?" she asked, moving closer despite herself. "A knife. My grandfather made it for me when I was 12 years old. He told me it was for cutting rope and opening packages." Marcus ran his thumb along the edge, drawing a thin line of blood. "He lied, of course. He knew what I would become, what all of us become eventually." Valara sat across from him, her fear slowly giving way to something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. "What are you, Marcus? What are humans, really?" He looked up at her, and for the first time since their wedding, she saw him without his mask of calm. Beneath it was exhaustion and grief and a strange, terrible pride. "We are what happens when a species evolves on a world that never stopped trying to kill it." He sheathed the knife and leaned back in his chair. "The Solari evolved on a paradise world. Gentle climate, abundant food, no predators worth mentioning. You had 10,000 years to develop art and philosophy, and all the beautiful things that make civilization worthwhile. And the Varkith, they evolved as apex predators, the biggest and strongest creatures on their world. Nothing challenged them, so they never learned to be clever. Just brutal." He met her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Humans had neither advantage. We were not strong enough to dominate our world, and we could not escape its dangers. Everything tried to kill us. The animals, the weather, the diseases. Even each other." He stood and walked toward her, stopping just close enough to touch. "So we adapted. We learned to use tools and fire and strategy. We learned to hunt creatures 100 times our size. We learned to survive ice ages and plagues and wars that killed millions." His voice dropped to a whisper. "We spent 200,000 years fighting for every breath. And by the end, we had become something that the galaxy has never seen before." "What?" Marcus smiled, and it was the saddest expression Valara had ever seen. "Survivors, Princess. Survivors who can kill anything that threatens us. Survivors who learned that mercy is a luxury only the strong can afford." He reached out and took her hand, his grip gentle despite the strength she knew he possessed. "The Varkith see themselves as predators and everyone else as prey. They cannot understand why prey would ever fight back, let alone win. But you are not prey." "No," he agreed, his eyes distant. "We are what prey becomes when it refuses to die. And that is far more dangerous than any predator." He released her hand and walked toward the door. "The ceasefire will not hold. Valara, the Varkith are too proud and too angry to accept defeat. And when they return, I will have to show them again what humanity is capable of." He paused at the threshold. looking back at her with something that might have been regret. "I am sorry that you were forced to marry a monster. But I promise you this, I will use everything I am to protect your people, even if it costs me whatever remains of my soul." Then he was gone, and Valara sat alone with the fire, thinking about the creature she had wed and the war that was yet to come. 6 months after Sarath Prime, the ceasefire collapsed exactly as Marcus had predicted. The Varkith Dominion had spent those months gathering every ship and soldier in their empire, stripping their conquered worlds of defenders to assemble the largest military force in galactic history. 2,000 warships and 10 million ground troops, all aimed at the heart of the Ascendancy like a spear forged from hatred and wounded pride. The Varkith Emperor himself broadcast their declaration of war, his massive form filling screens across the galaxy. "You have allied with monsters," he roared, his voice shaking with rage. "But we are the true apex predators of this galaxy, and we will drown your worlds in blood until nothing remains." But ash and memory, the Solari responded by mobilizing their own fleet. Elegant ships of crystal and light that had stood against the Varkith for 15 years. But everyone knew it would not be enough. The Varkith had committed everything to this assault, gambling their entire civilization on one massive strike. If they won, the Ascendancy would fall and humanity would lose its only foothold in this part of the galaxy. If they lost, the Dominion itself would crumble, and the species that had terrorized 100 worlds would face extinction. The final battle would take place at Varkith Prime, the home world of the Dominion, where their fleet waited behind layers of defense stations and orbital fortresses. The Solari Armada gathered at the edge of the system, 3,000 ships crewed by beings who knew they might not survive the day. And then the humans arrived. 50 ships dropped out of faster than light travel, old and scarred and covered in kill markings that told stories of 100 battles. They were tiny compared to the Solari vessels, ugly and brutal, where the Ascendancy fleet was elegant and beautiful. But every eye in the galaxy turned to watch them, because everyone remembered what 13 humans had done on Sarath Prime. Marcus stood on the bridge of his flagship, a vessel called a Prometheus that had served humanity since the first expansion into the stars. Around him his crew worked with quiet efficiency, preparing weapons and shields and engines for the fight to come. Valara watched him through a communication link from the Solari command ship, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. In the months since the ceasefire, she had found herself seeking his company, talking with him about his world and his people, and the strange philosophy that made them what they were. She had learned that humans laughed at death, turning their own mortality into jokes and songs. She had learned that they cried for strangers, feeling grief for people they had never met. She had learned that Marcus wrote poetry in his spare time, delicate verses about flowers and sunsets that seemed impossible from a man who could kill with such efficiency. He was a contradiction wrapped in flesh, gentle and terrible, kind and merciless, and she had fallen in love with him without even realizing it. Now she watched him prepare for a battle that might kill him, and the fear in her chest was sharper than any blade. "You do not have to do this," she said through the link. "Your people have already done enough." Marcus smiled, and for once it reached his eyes. "This is not about what we have to do, Valara. This is about what we choose to do." He turned to face the view screen, where the distant lights of the Varkith fleet glittered like angry stars. "I am going to broadcast a message to their homeworld. It is a human tradition before great battles." She wanted to argue, to beg him to stay safe, but she knew it would change nothing. "Then I will listen, husband." The words slipped out before she could stop it. The first time she had called him that without bitterness or obligation. Marcus paused, something flickering across his face that might have been hope. "I would like that, wife." The channel to Varkith Prime opened, and Marcus spoke with a voice that carried across light years. "This is Commander Marcus Cole of the Terran Alliance. I speak to the Varkith people, and to any who would stand against us." The bridge fell silent, every human present watching their commander with fierce pride. "You attacked our allies. You slaughtered civilians. You thought that humanity was weak because we sought peace instead of war." His voice hardened, becoming something cold and ancient. "You were wrong. We did not seek peace because we were weak. We sought it because we know what we become in war. We know the monster that lives in every human heart. The thing that clawed its way up from the mud of earth through millions of years of blood and fire." He leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "You are about to meet that monster, and you will learn why every species in history that tried to destroy us ended up as a footnote in our history books." The transmission ended, and the human fleet surged forward. What followed would be studied in military academies for 10,000 years, dissected and analyzed, and never quite understood. The humans did not fight like the Solari, with elegant formations and precise maneuvers. They fought like wolves, packs of ships working together to isolate and destroy enemies many times their size. They rammed Varkith cruisers with smaller vessels, their crews screaming war cries as they died to take enemies with them. They boarded dreadnoughts through hull breaches, human soldiers in basic armor fighting hand-to-hand against Varkith warriors in the corridors. They deployed weapons that the galactic community had banned centuries ago. Fire and acid and things that killed slowly and painfully. Marcus led from the front, his flagship cutting through the Varkith fleet like a blade through flesh. When his ship was crippled by enemy fire, he led a boarding party onto the Varkith command vessel itself. The recordings from that assault would become legend, showing humans fighting with a fury that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Marcus killed the Varkith admiral in single combat, their duel lasting nearly an hour as they fought across the burning bridge of the command ship. In the end, it was endurance that decided the battle, the admiral's strength failing while Marcus kept fighting despite wounds that should have killed him 10 times over. By the time the Solari Armada arrived, the Varkith fleet had been broken. Ships drifted dead in space, their crews slaughtered by enemies who gave no quarter and asked for none. The orbital defenses had been destroyed, the ground forces decimated by human soldiers who had dropped from orbit without parachutes. Varkith Prime itself was in chaos, cities burning and the population fleeing from monsters who had once been prey. Valara's shuttle landed on the flagship just as the last Varkith ship surrendered, and she ran through corridors filled with blood and bodies to find her husband. She found him on the bridge, standing before the view screen with his eyes fixed on the burning world below. His armor was shattered, his body covered in wounds that leaked red across the deck, and he swayed on his feet like a tree in a storm. "Marcus!" she cried, rushing to his side and catching him as he started to fall. He looked at her with eyes that seemed to see something far away. "We ended it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That is what humans do. We end things. You are hurt. You need medical attention." She tried to pull him toward the door, but he resisted, turning back to the view screen. "Look at it, Valara. Look at what we do when we stop being gentle." She looked, as she saw a world in flames, an empire shattered, a species that had terrorized the galaxy reduced to refugees. "Is this what you wanted?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. Marcus finally let her lead him away from the view screen, his weight heavy against her shoulder. "I wanted peace. I wanted a universe where we did not have to become monsters to survive." He laughed, a sound that held more pain than humor. "But that universe does not exist, so we do what we must and live with the guilt." The war ended that day, the Varkith Dominion collapsing into chaos as their military was destroyed and their worlds fell to revolution. Marcus spent 3 months in a medical chamber, his body rebuilding itself through technologies that the Solari had never seen. Valara stayed by his side every day, reading to him and talking to him and holding his hand through the worst of the healing. When he finally emerged, scarred but whole, she was waiting for him in the palace garden where he had trained so many mornings ago. "The council fears you now," she said, watching him move through the familiar forms of his exercises. "They should, and yet you married me. You bound yourself to peace." Marcus stopped and turned to face her, and she saw something new in his eyes. Not sorrow or exhaustion or the cold emptiness of war. Hope. "My people have a saying, to wear the fury of a patient man. We did not become the dominant species on Earth through rage alone." He stepped closer, close enough to touch. "We did it by knowing when to fight and when to build. War is easy for us. Peace is what we struggle to keep." Valara reached out and took his hand, the same hand that had killed thousands. "Then teach us," she said softly. "Teach us the human way." Marcus smiled, a real smile that transformed his scarred face into something almost beautiful. "The human way is simple, Princess. We protect what we love with everything we are, and then we try to build something worth protecting." He pulled her close, and she did not resist. "I would very much like to build something with you, if you will have me." Valara looked into the eyes of the monster who had saved her people, the killer who wrote poetry, the destroyer who dreamed of peace. "I already have you, husband. I think I have had you since the day you refused to touch me on our wedding night." Their kiss was witnessed by the rising sun and the flowers of 1,000 worlds.